So, we are in the middle of this series called Embrace the Chaos. You've probably been here for some of that. If you haven't, you can see we have this big, weird, fake wall right now, and there's not walls where there used to be walls, and there's not paint where there's usually paint. Like, all kinds of chaos is going on because we are in the middle of building projects, and we decided we are going to embrace this chaos and talk about some of the most fun, chaotic stories in the Old Testament. And today I get to talk about one of my favorite stories. I know I said that last week if you were here, but I'm going to say it again this week, and I'll probably say it again next week, because that's what happens when you get to choose what you're going to talk about. You can just talk about stuff that you think is really cool. So we're going to talk about the book of Judges, and specifically chapter 3 of Judges. And in that chapter, we are introduced to the first 3 judges that Israel has during the book of Judges. And traditionally, the book of Judges is thought to be written by Samuel. It covers a really long period of time, 400 years. It starts when Joshua dies at 110 years old, right? Moses and then Joshua lead Israel. And then from Joshua's death all the way till King David is anointed, there's 400 years that Judges kind of covers. And we see in these 400 years that Israel goes through these cycles of sin that I want to talk about. And these cycles of sin are also things that we go through in our lives. And so I think we can take them and apply them directly to our own lives. We see it again and again. If you read through the whole book of Judges, you see it multiple times where they go through this same cycle. It starts out like, hopefully we are serving the Lord. That's where the cycle starts. Things are going well. We're serving the Lord. Israel is serving the Lord, doing what God has called them to do. Everything is good. But then eventually the next step is that they succumb to sin. And we do this as well sometimes. We desire a sin, and maybe we look at it and we say, I shouldn't do that. But eventually we kind of say, okay, just one time I'll succumb to my sin. And they do that. Well, eventually, in all sins, you become enslaved to the sin. One time turns into multiple times, becomes complete enslavement to the sin in your lives. And the same thing happens with Israel again and again. They become enslaved to sin. Eventually, after they see the destruction that takes place in their lives, we do as well, we start to feel sorry for our sin. And then we cry out to God, as the Israelites do many times in Judges, and we are saved from our sin. We see the cycle again and again. This whole book, it is a reminder of mankind's propensity to forget about the blessings of God, to forget how good God is. And I think most of us can identify at some point in our lives, we just kind of forgot how good God was, and we start to fall into this cycle of sin again and again. So like I said, Joshua lives 110 years. He passes away, and then without spiritual leadership, within one generation, Israel begins to completely forget about God and to fall into worshiping of false gods, false idols. And specifically, they begin to worship the false gods Baal and Ashtoreth. And these are Canaanite gods, but what they represent honestly hasn't changed since then to now. Ashtoreth is a goddess of sensuality and sexuality. She represents people just kind of worshiping sexuality and it being all about physical pleasure. Baal represents prosperity. He was a god that they believed that Baal could give them larger crops, more things, more stuff. In fact, sometimes they would even worship their firstborn child, they would sacrifice their firstborn child to Baal in order to get more stuff, to get more things. And if you look at the world around us, things haven't changed that much. We don't call the gods that we worship by a name like Baal or Ashtoreth, but we still very much worship prosperity and sexuality, don't we? That is everywhere around us. So things haven't changed that much as we have these cycles of sin. If you're like me, you've read through the book of Judges before, and you see these cycles going on, and you say, man, how dense are these people? Like, they just keep doing it over and over and over again until one day it smacks you right upside the head that you are those people, that you have fallen again and again, and God has had to save you again and again. We see these cycles, they seem to be never ending, but God is always faithful and always raises up a judge to save Israel from the position that they find themselves in. So despite the fact that God's people continue to cycle through this process, he never abandons them. He raises up somebody to do something about it. And so we look to the judges. And when we look at judges in the Bible, it's not like a judicial judge like we think of as a judge. For them, a judge is somebody that is a rescuer, a deliverer, or one of my favorite names for them is an instigator. Somebody that will start something, somebody that will stir the pot when the pot needs to be stirred, right? That is their role in Israel. They will raise up and do what needs to be done. They're not perfect people by any means. In fact, for most of them throughout the book of Judges, we don't get any indication that there's really anything special or really all that different about them, other than that they were willing to do what God asked them to do, to call people into a right relationship with God. So in Judges chapter 3, we meet the first 3 judges that are recorded in the book. Mainly, I'm going to talk about the second one, but I want to real quick just say a couple things about the first and the third. The first judge is Othniel. Othniel, we get a whole 5 verses about Othniel. We learn almost nothing about him as an individual other than that he is Caleb's nephew. If you remember the story of Joshua and Caleb, they were 2 of the 12 spies that God sent into the land of Canaan to check things out, to see if it was time for them to go in and to claim their blessing. And Caleb and Joshua were the only ones that came back and said, yes, let's do it. Let's go claim the blessing that God has for us. And so they are famous. They are well known by all of Israel. And so Othniel, for probably most of his life, people don't even know who Othniel is. They just say, hey, aren't you Caleb's nephew? And that's his entire identity, maybe. And I don't know if you've ever been that person who you're only known because you're related to somebody else. That's not a great feeling. The first 3 years or so that my wife and I were together, so a year of dating and the first couple years that we were married, we attended the church that she grew up in, like from the womb. And her mom and dad were both in full-time ministry at that church. Every elder of the church believed that Katie was their second daughter. By the way, my wife, if you don't know, she's the one that was singing on the piano over here, and I'm not allowed to say how awesome she is because she gets mad at me and says, it's Jesus, not me. So, yeah, proud husband. Everybody knew Katie, nobody knew me. And so for the first 3 years we were together, I was not Nick. I was Katie's boyfriend or Katie's husband or, oh, aren't you married to Katie Burrows? Actually, her name's Katie Risto, but yes, thank you very much. My name is Nick. So I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've been there. And poor Othniel is probably thinking I have a name. I'm not just Caleb's nephew. But Othniel is used to save Israel. He becomes a judge. He wasn't a front runner that anybody knew. He wasn't famous or legendary. He was just Othniel. The third judge that we meet is Shamgar, which, by the way, if you're having a baby anytime soon, I highly recommend Shamgar. You guys should think about that for real. Yeah, Shamgar, that would be good. Shamgar, we get a whole 1 verse to get to know Shamgar. All we know about Shamgar is that his dad's name is Anath and that he saved Israel because he had an ox goad, which you guys might know because you're farming community. Back on the West Coast, nobody had a clue what an ox goad was, but it's a pointy stick, basically, a big pointy stick that you goad an ox with. Shamgar takes a pointy stick, kills 600 Philistine warriors with his stick, and becomes like an amazing warrior for Israel. That's amazing. But there was nothing that we see that made Shamgar step out, look good, other than he has an awesome name. Seriously, think about it, guys. Okay, so we're going to go to the second judge. This is the one we're going to talk the most about. His name is Ehud. Another great name, Ehud. One of my favorite weird stories in the Bible, Ehud. Now, I'm a youth pastor, so be afraid. This story, you'll see why. If there's ever a middle school boy who says, I don't want to read the Bible, it's boring, I go directly to Ehud. So, Judges chapter 3, verses 12 through 30. If you want to follow along, you have your Bibles. It's on the screen, and it's in your sermon notes, so you have no excuse. Judges chapter 3, verse 12. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of Palms, which is Jericho. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjaminite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret for you. The king said to his attendants, Leave us, and they all left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, I have a message from God for you. As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked him. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. They waited to the point of embarrassment. But when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fallen on the floor dead. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the stone images and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. Follow me, he ordered, for the Lord has given Moab your enemy into your hands. So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not one escaped. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. Weird story, right? Middle school boys love it. God allows Eglon, whose name literally means big calf, like cow. He gives Eglon the ability to reign over Israel for a time. And Eglon, so you know, he's not chubby like me. This is like big dude. Like if you've seen Star Wars, picture Jabba the Hutt. Like this is Eglon, right? He's a big guy. And he is the king of Moab. He's the only person in the entire Bible that is called a very fat man. God uses Eglon to be raised up to chastise his people. And that's hard for us. Sometimes it's hard for me to think that God would use somebody to chastise his people, to punish people. But in a way, we have to realize that if God had allowed the people to just continue to go away from him forever, he would not be a good God, would he? If he just allowed people to just completely abandon their faith, because they would be destroying themselves. And so God has to use someone like Eglon to bring them back. Hebrews 12:6 says that the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as a child. It's hard for us, but I understand it as a dad. If I were to just let my children run from God and run from everything that they should be doing, I wouldn't be a good father at all, would I? There's a story that another preacher tells. I love it because it's such a perfect visual, but he talks about his family and him were going on a trip, and they were all leaving the house to get into their family vehicle, and his daughter, who was very young at the time, takes off out the front door sprinting. And he lived on a very busy road, maybe even a highway, and he says he sees his daughter sprinting towards the road, and he looks on the road and he sees a truck, and the truck is coming. And so by instinct, he reaches out and he grabs his daughter by her little ponytail, and he yanks her backwards. Now in that moment, all this little girl knows is that her daddy just hurt her really badly. That's all she can probably think about at that moment, is the pain that her father has inflicted upon her. Maybe she's even got some scrapes and bruises. But she doesn't realize that her father has just saved her life from the truck that was coming that could have killed her. And oftentimes our relationship with God is the same way. He has to pull our ponytail back, get us out of harm's way, but all we can focus on is, that really hurt. Why would you do that to me? And we don't even see what God has saved us from. So Eglon rules over Israel for 18 years. And then we meet our judge, our instigator, Ehud. Ehud, we have very little information about him as well. We don't know why God would call him specifically. All we know is that his dad's name is Gera. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he is left-handed, which is very important to the story. He's a left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin, which ironically means son of my right hand. But he's a lefty. And he lives in a world, in a society where being left-handed was a curse. It was something that you would not want anybody to know about you. It was considered a weakness to be left-handed. How many lefties do we have out there? Okay. Supposedly about 10% of the population are left-handed people. Being left-handed has always been a little bit awkward for people. I'm righty. I can't identify with this totally. But throughout history, it's a little weird. If you look in the French language, the word for left-handed is also loosely the word awkward. So that's nice if you're French. If you go all the way back to the Latin word for left-handed, it's sinister. Sounds terrible, like you sinister lefty. If you skateboard or snowboard with your right foot forward the way that a left-handed person would do, you're called goofy foot. So if you're lefty, you're goofy, which for some reason I do that even though I'm not left-handed. If you have two left feet, you're clumsy and you can't dance. There's all kinds of weird, like, anti-left hand agenda things. So I'm sorry, lefties, we love you. But have you ever seen a left-handed person try to cut with regular scissors? It's sad and hilarious. But if you've never thought of that, you need to watch it. It's funny. So at some point, Ehud in his life probably wondered why God would make him different. Why God allowed him to be left-handed. And it seems silly to us now, but at the time, that was probably a real struggle for him. To be viewed as different than other people, to have a weakness that makes him stand out. But we're going to see how God can use somebody different and how he can take something that is normally seen as a weakness and use it as a strength for his kingdom. So Israel, not knowing Ehud's plan that God has given him, Israel sends Ehud to Eglon with a tribute, basically a way of sucking up to Eglon, saying like, hey, be nice to us, here's a bunch of money. And notice it says that there were multiple men carrying the tribute. This is not a little bag in Ehud's pocket. It's just like, hey, here's some gold coins. No, this is like a trunk full of treasure that they are giving to the king, saying, treat us well, and we will continue to just give you gifts. But Ehud has another plan that he thought out. It tells us early in the story that he made or fashioned a double-edged sword or dagger beforehand. So this is malice and forethought, right? It says it's about a cubit long, which if you don't know is usually on most men, it's from the elbow to the tip of your finger. So that's a nice sized dagger. And he makes that, and he has it strapped to his right thigh. And that's important to the story because he's left-handed. And if you're going for a dagger, you reach across your body just like you do with a sword, right? Well, the king's guards probably searched everybody before they went in to see the king. But because it was completely normal to be right-handed, they would only search the left thigh of anybody that was going in to visit the king. So they go in, they get searched, everything is fine. Ehud gets in the whole time with his dagger on his right thigh, and they don't know. So God right there uses the fact that Ehud is a left-hander to get him into a place where he needs to be, to do what he needs to do. After the initial meeting where they give Eglon the money, he tricks the king into being alone with him. He says, hey, I have a secret message for you. And he says, I have a message from God for you. So he tricks him in to be in there, and then he straight up assassinates Eglon, like in brutal fashion. And I'm not going to stick to it too much because I want to, but the story, right? He sticks the dagger into the king, and it says he was so big that the dagger that's that long goes completely into the king, the hilt and handle disappear, and his fat encloses the whole thing inside of him. This is a big dude. And it says that his entrails, his bowels, empty. In the old King James Version, it says the dirt came out, right? It's a crazy story. So then Ehud escapes out the window. The guards don't know anything is going on, but I imagine that they probably smell something a little funky. And so they go to the door and they say, oh, he's going to the bathroom. We'll let him be. And then I love the story says they waited to the point of embarrassment. So someone's in the bathroom and you're like, they've been in there like a really long time. This is getting awkward. That's what happens. It's been awkward how long he's been in there. So they finally go in, they find him dead, and Ehud is gone. Ehud goes, he blows the trumpet to raise up Israel's army. It's the first time in 18 years that they have rose up to defend themselves. They go down and they annihilate 10,000 Moabite warriors, strong men, full of vigor. God gives them this victory, and it all starts with God using a guy named Ehud to get into a place that normally somebody couldn't get and to do something amazing. Ehud was able to take something that was seen as a weakness, seen as a challenge, and use it for the glory of God. How often do we see the things that we have in our lives that are weaknesses, that are challenges for us, as something that God can use for his glory, that he can use to use us? I want to tell you one more story, and it's a story from a couple weeks ago. I was on a mission trip with kids. A lot of you saw the picture of them last week. We went to St. Paul, Minnesota, and we served with Youth Works and did all kinds of work around the community of St. Paul. I met a kid on this trip who was also on the trip. His group was from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and his name was Reese. And Reese was a different kid. My first interaction with Reese was I went into where we were all sleeping, all the guys. I put my little twin-size air mattress down, filled it up, and I laid down on my mattress. And all of a sudden, somebody in the room said something about spiders. And then Reese started talking, and Reese didn't stop talking for 30 minutes about spiders. Reese knew everything you can imagine, everything you never wanted to know about spiders. Reese knew about spiders. He knew the most venomous ones, the ones that were most deadly, the ones that were totally safe, the ones that were his best friends, like everything you could ever want to know. At one point, it was so awkward to me, I took a video of my own face and just had him talking in the background. I sent it to my wife, and it was just 2 minutes of Reese reciting facts about spiders. The boys that were with me, they looked over, they're like, haha, you chose the wrong place to sleep. And it was just, Reese was an interesting kid. I started to notice that he didn't engage in any of the meetings that we had. He didn't really want to be a part of the group. I started to realize like all Reese did was read, draw pictures, and do origami pieces. He would make these origami things, and they weren't like simple little airplanes. They were like dragons and lizards, and I mean like these crazy three-dimensional origami pieces that he could make 100% from memory. He wasn't reading any instructions. He knew out of his head how to do all of these things by heart. So I started to realize, like, okay, Reese is different, and I found out from one of his leaders that he was on the autism spectrum. And I'll admit, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, I'll admit, like, my first thought once I found out that he was autistic was like, is Reese really going to get anything out of being on this trip? Like, if he can't engage fully in what's going on, like, what's he going to gain from being here? I found out the answer to that pretty quickly. The night before our last day working, something happened. Their group was working at a center that fed hungry people. 250 to 300 people every single day came through this center and got free meals. And from what I had heard, Reese, much like he was with us, didn't really engage in a lot of what was going on. He kind of stayed off by himself, drawing pictures and making little pieces of origami. But there was a couple times where Reese would give his piece of origami to one of the clients of the center, and later found out like that when he would give them one of these pieces of origami, that they would seem very happy about it. And so for Reese, that was awesome. Like Reese realized, like, if I just make some origami and give it to somebody, it makes them happy. And so Reese hatched this plan in his head that on the last day that they were at the center, he was going to give every single client a piece of origami. This meant he needed 250 to 300 pieces of origami in one day. And so that night, his group recruited all of us. And so we all sat, there's 40, 50 of us in this room, and we're sitting around those big round tables, and they say, okay, we're going to make origami. And I'm like, dude, I don't have a clue. Unless you need paper airplanes, I can't make origamis. It's okay. Reese will walk you through all of it step by step. And he did. There's 6 tables of us, and Reese is running back and forth, telling every one of us step-by-step instructions from memory, from like photographic memory, how to make these things. And so one table's making like dragons, and another one's making lizards. My table, I made a fully functional box out of a piece of paper. Like, it was so cool. And Reese directed the entire thing. He went from like being barely engaged at all to directing everybody on what to do. And in one night, in a few hours, we made 300 pieces of origami. And they took them all to the center the next day. And so I wondered all day long, like, how did that go? And so we got back that night, and the site director, Betsy, asked Reese if he would be willing to come up and talk about what happened at the center. Now remember, this kid didn't even engage in the group. He was back here, but on that last night, Reese is in front of everybody, and he's telling us what had happened. And he's telling us that every time that they gave a piece of origami to one of the hungry people at the center, their face would light up. And he said, just very simply said, it felt good to make people happy. This kid who has some challenges in his life that are almost always seen as weaknesses, They're almost always seen as a challenge to just function with everybody else, was able to rally an entire group of people together, teach us step-by-step instructions, make 300 pieces of origami, and then make 300 people smile as they went through line to get a meal. And to just hear him, to see his face light up when he realized that he was able to do something that made other people happy was incredible. It was one of the greatest examples I have ever seen of God taking something that would usually be seen as a challenge and using it to do something incredible in somebody's life. I started the week with Reese wondering if he would get anything out of the trip. And by the end of it, I realized that he had given hundreds of people a blessing by being there. Maybe you don't think you're special. Maybe you don't think you have anything to offer God. Maybe you're left-handed. Maybe you're only known because you're related to somebody else who's known more. Maybe all you have is a pointy stick to offer God. But God can and will use anybody who is willing to listen to him and willing to take action when he calls you to take action. Amen.